Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, president of AG Financial Insurance, and we're here for Risk Management Live, and we have some church decision makers here. We're happy to be with Hope Church, and actually we appreciate Pastor Gary letting us use his facility here for this Risk Management Live. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to our panel, our distinguished panel. We have Rich Hammar. Rich Hammar is General Counsel for the General Council of the Assemblies of God, and my partner in all of these Risk Management Lives. Rich, thanks for being with us again. We have Gary Hay, who is the lead pastor here at Hope Church. We've got Tom Demers, which is the executive pastor from High Street. And we have Carter McDaniel, the business administrator at Central Assembly of God. So thanks, guys, for being with us. Thanks for letting us use your facility.
Sure, no problem.
If you have questions while we're doing this program, feel free to email me at the bottom of the screen where you're watching this, and we'll go ahead and try to get to your questions. I know that these guys have lots of questions that we're going to try to get through, and then we're going to try to do a lot of comparison of how each church does things, so you know how to do things better. So we're going to start off right with that, and I think, Carter, you were going to ask the first question.
Yeah, Jerry, I think for all of us here, a primary concern is keeping our people in our ministry safe, and right hand in hand with that is keeping the ministries we serve out of the courtroom. So I kind of was wondering what would be one of the main reasons that churches land in court, and Rich, maybe you could comment on if you're seeing a change in the amount of litigation involving churches.
Yeah, okay, Carter, let me, like a good presidential candidate in one of their debates, you never answer the question that's asked. You answer the question you wish they would have. So that's what I'm going to do. We'll start with the question, is church litigation exploding? Are we having more cases than we've had in the past? And I don't know that anybody perhaps knows the answer to that question better than I do, because for the last 15 years, I've read every case decided in the country, all 50 states, all federal courts, pertaining to religious organizations. And the numbers have been constant. So I think that's probably maybe the best evidence. Now, I'm not talking about claims made. You might get a little bit different picture, Jerry, looking at insurance records, but I'm talking about actual litigation. And that number has been pretty constant, plus or minus 10% maybe. In terms of your question, Carter, what is the leading cause of litigation? That's been true for 7 of the last 8 years. It's been child molestation, sexual abuse of a minor. So the idea that that's a risk that's going away simply is not true. And I think sometimes churches experience fatigue with this issue. We've been committed to this for so long. Can't we lighten up? And the answer is no. The evidence is clear. This remains the biggest legal risk churches in America face. So it would be well, I think, for church leaders to periodically reevaluate, reassess what they're doing, make sure you're in compliance with your policies, because the worst position you can possibly be in is having effective policies that are not implemented fully. I mean, that's going to be the worst position legally, you can possibly be in. So that's the number one risk.
Let me let's just talk about minimizing that risk. So we know that, Rich, I know that we see working with the insurance for the Assemblies of God. I know that we see, we've seen an uptick in actual lawsuits filed, but a lot of that could be because of the economy and that sort of stuff. But let's talk about minimizing how we can minimize the liability with a minor. So
yeah,
let's start with a written application.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have your volunteers having a written application filled out, okay? In that written application, you should be getting permission to run a background check. Mm-hmm. And you want to talk about what goes into that background check?
Yeah, well, that would be like the second step. The first step's the written application in terms of risk management. And I think the second step is an interview.
Right.
If you don't really know this person well. Why do you want to be involved in some capacity in the church involving youth or minors? And that's what we're talking about here. And then number 3, which I think is the most important ingredient in risk management in this context, is doing reference checks. And I don't mean reference checks from people you've never heard of before. I see churches do this all the time. They get references. Here's a church in Missouri, and they do reference checks on this guy that wants to teach kindergarten. that comes in off the street with sunglasses and a trench coat and wants to work with children. You never heard of it. Oh, good, you're an answer to our prayer. And you put them to work right away. You know, the best way to screen somebody like that is not even a criminal records check, which we'll recommend here shortly, but it's an institutional reference. And by institutional reference, I don't mean an individual reference. I mean a reference from another institution where this person has worked with minors. Who better to evaluate this person's fitness for working with minors than some other organization that has used him with minors? And that's going to be another church or churches. That's going to be scouts. That's going to be teaching, coaching. There's any number of ways people are. It's rare for somebody to say out of the blue, well, I want to start working with minors. Usually people have a record and they've worked in other facilities. And so to get 2 or 3 of those other organizations and that have observed this person, maybe other churches in your community in some cases, and get a reference from them. The ultimate question is, do you know of any reason why this person would not be suitable for working with minors in our church? And if you have 3 or 4 of these entities say no, that's the gold standard. You can't beat that. Now, but what happens is churches just get references from people. You know, the FBI has done a profile on child molesters, and it's in its 4th edition now. Kenneth Lanning, a retired agent, was the primary author, and he lists several factors that, you know, it's impossible to determine if somebody's a child molester, but there are certain factors that indicate a disposition in that direction. And one of the factors he mentions is the only adult friends of pedophiles tend to be other pedophiles. And so what are they going to do? They're going to list their pedophile friends as references. They may be in different states, and you get a reference from, oh, this guy's wonderful working with children. That is not only worthless, but it's dangerous. And that's why I disclaim personal references, and you must get institutional reference. If a person, in fact, has never worked with minors before, that's a red flag. But in that case, you're left with references that are individuals, but I would limit it to members of your congregation at that point, not unknown people.
Let's go ahead and talk about, you know, using members of your congregation. How long should they be a member of your congregation before you would think that they should be used?
That's the 4th risk management principle. You know, we've talked about the application, we've talked about the interview, we've talked about the institutional references. The 4th component, I think, is what I call the 6-month rule. I've called it that for 20 years. And, you know, people quibble over, well, you know, can we make it just attending the church for 6 months? I have always adopted the rule of membership for 6 months. If you want to make it a year, that's fine with me. But the person is subjected to the discipline of the church. And and furthermore, it takes a period of time for the person to qualify for membership. So you have more time to observe this person, and that's what you want to be able to share if there's a case of child molestation, and you're sued for negligence in selecting this person. It just is going to help you, as opposed to taking a person off the street, giving them 30 days, attending the church sporadically. That's the other end of the spectrum. And so I have followed that rule. Now, there will be certain exceptions to that. For example, if it's going to be a paid employee, let's say a children's pastor, they're not going to be a member of the church for 6 months. But we're talking here predominantly about volunteer workers, which is the preponderance of people that work with minors.
Let's go back to a background check. What should actually be in that background check?
Well, here we're talking about criminal records checks largely. And I think the 2 principal components of it, and this is really the, are we up to number 5 now?
Yeah.
The criminal records check, in my opinion, is twofold. You need to do a national criminal file, and you need to do a national sex offender public registry check to see if this person's on a sex offender registry, not in your state, but nationwide, which looks at all 50 states simultaneously. And those are the 2 critical components. And you know, there are a number of companies now that do these components for a relatively minor charge, under $10 per person. And so that is something that we recommend. Some churches think that just doing the criminal records checks are enough. And you know, we've talked about a case before in this program where a church hired somebody as a pastor who had been a pastor in Maryland and Alabama, had molested children in both churches. The churches dealt with it as a matter of internal discipline. And So they didn't do they did a criminal records check. In the third church, which was in Florida, that hired this guy, they did a criminal records check, and nothing turned up, because those churches in Alabama and Maryland, where he had molested children, they dealt with this as an issue of internal discipline. They didn't report it to the authorities. And so the guy had no criminal record. And so a court ruled, and in fact it was a $12.5 million verdict, that doing the criminal records check was not enough. That was negligent on your part. Yes, that's an important component, but it's not the only component. You should have, in addition, done a reference check. Contact those prior churches. The pastors of those churches said they would have acknowledged what had happened. And the molestation in the church in Florida would have never happened. So I think that's important to recognize that, as important as the criminal records check is, it's part of this basket of recommendations that we're making here today.
Well, let's go right on to number 6 then, the 2 adult rules. So never let a child be alone with one adult. Always make sure.
One child alone with one adult.
Correct.
Yeah, because it's typical for Sunday school classes of children, for example, to have multiple children with one adult, and that's the public school model. You go to your public school down the street, and you go into a 3rd grade classroom. There's 30 kids and 1 teacher. That doesn't violate. I mean, why some churches think, well, we have to have 2 adults in every classroom. If that's what you want to do, if you have the manpower to do it, go for it. But it's just it's an excessive principle that is not necessary. I think if you align your practices with the public schools, that's the state. That's a state instrumentality. So you're demonstrating the exercise of reasonable care, I think, if you follow the state principle. And the state principle is not having 2 adults present in classrooms, although some do.
Sounds good. Jerry, you want to answer the next question?
Yes, I think probably most of us feel very vulnerable where our children are concerned. And so the handling of our children and the safety of our children probably make up the preponderance of our concerns. So check-in of children. Now that's an issue we've been working with for a long time, as probably most of the pastors here have. Guys, what kind of a check-in system are you using, and have you had any problems with it?
Well, we started about 10 years ago with an electronic check-in system, and the first problem we discovered was too many kids at once. So we had to cut it back to just doing birth through kindergarten, and we've rolled it back up now from birth all the way through 5th grade. And it's been very helpful for us because it prevents problems when there's a custody case and maybe the dad is not supposed to bring the kids home. And we've had a couple of situations where we've had to have a conversation. We've never had to involve law enforcement. We've had to have a conversation with somebody and say, we can't let you pick them up right now. You're gonna have to wait for the mom to show up or some other family member who is allowed to do that. And that's been helpful for us. And new people coming in, most of the time appreciate it. Every once in a while they question and say, why do we have to print this sticker off and then come back later? And ours allows for either a finger or thumbprint, or there's a fob that you can use, and it's very convenient as a parent who goes in, and I have kids that are in that age range, so it's just stick your finger on, print it off, and go pick them up.
Sounds good. Carter, what are you using?
Ours is pretty similar to Tom's. We don't use the biometric scanners or a fob, but we just enter a phone number when you come in, and it recognizes your family. Parent clicks on the screen who is attending, and there's a series of labels that are printed. The kids get a label that has their name, any allergies that they have, and a security code is printed on there. It's a unique code for each family every week. The parents get a copy of that has only the code and the date. So when the parents come and pick up their child, they've got to identify their child by name and then present that code. Then we have to see the paper. Then we don't have to get the paper. You might have multiple kids you have to pick up. We have to know that code matches what's on the child's sticker. And that kind of helps us verify that the same person who brought the child is the person who is picking up the child. If you don't have that sticker, we've kind of got a little policy that we go through where we track down who actually did the checking in that day, so we can verify that you actually either lost it or that the right thing's going on. We have usually some security personnel are involved with that, because that's what you see, I think, most commonly in those custody situations is you'll have somebody that is in a split custody situation. Sometimes you'll see the parent without custody will just come and say, well, I'm here to pick them up. Well, they don't have the sticker, and the first thing they'll say is, well, I lost it. So you kind of have to have a plan for what you're going to do in that moment as well. I think sometimes it's easy to think, well, we've got this electronic system, but it's really the policies that you follow that back it up, I think, that are just as important, and that's something we've kind of learned through a few of those situations, and we've had to make some adjustments along the way. But by and large, our electronic system has worked really well. The parents like it, the teachers like it, and it helps us kind of be able to identify those security issues when they come up.
And Carter, this is kind of off the topic a little bit, but in terms of electronics, at our church, we attend the same church. A few weeks ago, I'm a greeter outside of one door into the sanctuary, and I noticed like a carry-on suitcase propped up against the wall right by the door. And I thought that was odd. Well, we have a security staff, and those guys were able to we have a video camera out in the hallway, and this is one of the point I'm making is the power of video technology. It's a great preventive. And we were able to roll the tape. You might want to mention that.
Yeah, we were able to use our security cameras to look back at who had dropped that suitcase off, and then actually also using our church management database, which is the same database that provides the check-in services, look up some contact information for the person who dropped it off or people that we thought knew that person, so we could kind of sort out what was the purpose of that suitcase being there. By using that database system in tandem with the security system, we kind of figured out what classroom the person who dropped the bag off might be in and how to contact them in the most efficient way to figure out that it was actually it was not a threat, it was just a bag that they had brought to church that day.
But it added a sense of excitement to me being with that bag sitting there.
It was certainly.
I didn't hear anything ticking.
It was a sense of excitement is a good way to explain that.
Yeah.
Let's just talk about cameras. What about, do you all have cameras in classrooms?
We do, and that's been one of our big discussions lately is what constitutes due diligence in terms of your archiving of that kind of footage. Should a claim be made or something like that? What would be the recommended time frame?
Well, it depends on, I think, the context. For example, our camera in the main lobby of the church, if nothing's happened, if no claims or charge, I mean, I don't see why that would have to be kept for any protracted period of time. I don't know what the number would be, maybe a year. It's done electronically, so that's digitally. It's not like in the old days where you had VHS tapes you had to store, you had to build a warehouse to put them. And with regard to youth, let's say in the nursery, which I think that's a powerful place. I don't recommend that you need videos in every classroom. Like I teach a 5th grade Sunday school class and I don't have a video in there. But for the children who can't explain suspicious marks on their body when their parents pick them up, I think it's a powerful preventive technique. And how long do you keep those? Well, you don't have to keep them long. You can just have a staff member assigned maybe every Monday to review the tape, the video, and on fast forward, and you can see if there's any problem. And they could fill out an affidavit at the end of watching that. It might take them 10 minutes, and then you can erase it.
One of the things that you might want to mention is actually having a policy. So whatever your policy is when it comes to maintaining that tape, that you follow that policy. So actually, if something does come out and they said, we want your tape, as long as you're following that policy that you set forth, it looks reasonable and it looks like you're using due diligence and care with anybody that would question it.
And of course, again, I go back to my earlier point, contact the public schools and their administrative offices, and do they utilize video cameras? And to the extent they do in certain settings, how long do they retain those videos? And again, aligning yourself to the public schools, that's a state instrumentality. I mean, how can you be viewed as negligent under those circumstances? And if they don't have a policy, do your benchmarking. Contact other churches, other charities that are youth serving, not necessarily limited to churches, and find out what they're doing. That's the standard by which you're going to be judged.
That's great.
Excellent. Excellent.
Well, going along the lines of child safety, we do a lot of activities with our young people, especially high school students. And that can be anything from go-karting to swimming to whatever. One of the conversations that we've had in the past at our church is, do we want them to fill out a waiver? And I know you've mentioned this idea of a parental consent form. Can you talk about the difference between those two and the effectiveness of each of those documents?
Yeah, that's a good question. Very common question. A waiver or release of liability, it's an exculpatory document where you're trying to relieve yourself of liability for your own negligence. I have ethical problems with that. That's what we have insurance for, to cover damages associated with our negligence. But churches use them all the time. And one of the problems is they don't apply, children under 18 have no contractual capacity. They cannot enter into contractual agreements. And so a child that's 10 or 5 or 8 or 17, a child is anyone under the age of 18, they wouldn't have the ability to, or the legal status to sign such a form. And the key thing that a lot of church leaders don't understand is parents can't sign for them. A parent can release his or her own, can release the church from liability for damages to the parent, loss of society of their child if the child's killed, for example, pain and suffering, emotional pain that they may encounter because the child's a quadriplegic. But the parents cannot release any rights that the child has to proceed against the church for a personal injury claim. So, so they are very dubious value in youth activities. And so that's why I question whether you need them. But I do believe you need a parental consent form. And that form does four or five things. Number one, the parent consents to the child participating in this activity. You're going rope rappelling, you're going swimming at the lake. Well, my kid doesn't know how to swim in that murky water. They go under and you can't find them. You have about a 6-inch visibility. Those are highly dangerous events. And by the way, with regard to that, I never recommend any water event unless there are certified lifeguards on duty in that circumstance. And then the form should also identify whether or not the child can swim, if there's going to be any access to water. The form needs to give the parent the ability to say, I don't want my child participating in this event. You need to describe what the events are going to be. And if you do not want your child to participate, please identify. That's very important. And then, of course, you need to list medical conditions that may be relevant in the event of an injury, allergies, for example, if there's, depending on the food they're going to be eating. Those are all important components. And then, lastly, identifying somebody to make medical decisions, emergency medical decisions, in the event the parents can't be contacted. Of course, the form lists the parents' contact info, email, cell phone, etc. But in the event, it's rolled over to voicemail and you can't find anybody, you got to make this decision. The kid's sitting there with blood spurting out of his neck. You have somebody that can make that decision. So that's important. Now, let me just tell you this. I read about 1,000 cases a month, and you say, well, that doesn't sound like much. Well, it's 33 a day, 7 days a week. That's a lot of cases.
A lot of cases.
And fortunately, I'm a speed reader. I have very little comprehension, but I can read quickly. and I came across, sometimes I read a case, Tom, that just stuns me. And that's what happened to me a couple weeks ago. I read a case, and this was a Connecticut court that dealt with a study abroad program by a private boarding school called Hotchkiss School. When I was at Harvard Law School, there was a lot of prep school graduates that were there, that had gone there, and a lot of Hotchkiss grads, Phillips Exeter, Phillips Academy, a lot of private academies in New England that a lot of people aren't even aware they exist, but they are boarding schools. You send your 8th grade child, 10th grade child to these schools. They stay there just like college dorms, and they're like fast tracks to get into Ivy League colleges and then graduate schools. And that's what Hotchkiss is. They've had some very eminent alumni from that school. And they took a group of 15, 16-year-old kids on a study abroad program in China and to just immerse themselves in Chinese language and culture for 1 month. And they were doing some hiking on this trail in northern China. And at the top, the group leader decided, okay, let's go back down. And 3 of the girls said, we're going to take a shortcut. We're going to cut through the brush over here. So they went through another, they went down the hill a different way that took them through vegetation. And when they all got down at the clearing down below where their bus was, one of the girls that had cut through the shortcut I mean, she had chigger bites all over her, and one of them did not heal. In fact, it grew. And after about, on about the 12th day or so, she became, she started experiencing paraplegia, intense fevers, dementia, and what they ended up doing was calling her parents, of course, and the dad flew out to China and picked his daughter up and took her back to New York City, put her in a hospital. She was diagnosed with TBE, tick-borne encephalitis, and long story short, she did experience permanent brain damage. And so the parents, on behalf of their 15-year-old daughter, sued Hotchkiss School and won a jury verdict of $40 million. I was stunned when I read this. What did they do wrong? The plaintiff's attorney said, you didn't contact the Centers for Disease Control and find out if that area of China was on a watch list or on some warning area, and you didn't follow the basic recommendations that are right on that website. So, I mean, the application of that case, as I read it, to churches was just phenomenal, because think of the thousands of churches in this country that send kids overseas on short-term missions trips to third world areas without the slightest idea what we're exposing. So this case stands for the proposition, if you're sending a group of kids, and I would say anywhere in the US or overseas, because there's an outbreak in a number of states now of West Nile virus, which is potentially fatal. It's shown up in Oklahoma, Kentucky, Massachusetts, I mean, it's a widespread geographic distribution. And so check out the CDC website. The area where we're taking these kids, and it can be adults for that matter, are there CDC warnings about this area, and what are the prophylactic, the preventive measures that are recommended? And if you follow those, you see what I'm saying? That's the federal government telling us what to do, where not to go, or if we do go to certain areas, here's what you need to do. All of that is there on that website. And that's what the plaintiff's attorney said. Had that school done this, this case would never happen. They talk about the kinds of insect repellent to wear, the kinds of clothing to wear, and how to inspect yourself for ticks periodically. And it's a very effective, very thorough website. I've reviewed it. And of course, I think as well, to expand upon that would be to contact a local physician for additional recommendations that deals with infectious or insect-borne or tropical diseases. What other, you can say, here's what we're doing based on the CDC recommendations. Do you have any further recommendations? I mean, just think, what's the jury going to say if you do that much? You follow the CDC recommendations. You contact a local physician for additional recommendations. How is that negligent? You were reckless in sending those kids over. I think you've got an excellent case. I think that's an issue for every church that's sending groups, and like I say, it's not just minors, but it's also adults, to make sure that you are apprising yourself well in advance and informing parents of what these risks are, and do you still want your child to come? Here's the risks, here's what we're going to be doing about it. The parents need to be involved, which they were not completely in the Hotchkiss case. So I think there's a lesson there for church leaders.
One of the things too that was interesting about that case is there was a waiver of liability and a release signed.
Let me mention that, Jerry. Okay. That's a good point. The parents did sign a release of liability, and the court threw it out. Yeah. Why? Courts hate waivers and releases of liability because you're trying to relieve yourself of consequences for what you've done. And so the court said they hate, and so they look for any way to avoid these things. And so they came up with several reasons why they avoided it. Number one, it didn't explicitly identify the risks involved. Harm of any kind, injuries of any kind, forget it. You've got to itemize those risks. They have got to look down that list and see exactly what happened to that kid, which they didn't have tick-borne encephalitis on their list. So they threw it out for that reason. And then they talked about it's a contract of adhesion, which is a legal concept, which means take it or leave it, just like going and renting a U-Haul with that 15-page form. You say, well, I want to change item number 78. I mean, they're going to say drop dead. That 18-year-old clerk that doesn't know why, that has no authority. So if you're in a take it or leave it situation with no opportunity to negotiate or the terms, that's an adhesion contract, and the courts looked with extreme disfavor on those. It violated public policy. trying to relieve an entity from liability for injuries, catastrophic injuries to a minor. And so for these and among other reasons, the court threw that out.
So as a church, we would be better served to forget about waivers and use a good parental consent form that details the activities that are happening and have one for every activity.
Yes, yes. And you can do a waiver for adults,
Okay.
but I prefer, because an adult can waive, but it gets to be that ethical component again. Is that what we want to do? We have insurance to cover these people for injuries that are due to our negligence, and do we really want that? Something else you might consider is what I've recommended for several years is an assumption of risk form, where an adult can do this. You're going to a third world country, and you can, there's all kinds of risks of tick-borne or insect-borne diseases, of inadequate medical care, inadequate transportation, terrorism, who knows what it is. Adults have the right to assume risks as long as they're known risks and it's a voluntary assumption. Those are the two requirements. So again, you need to explicitly list what the risks are, and then a voluntary, I understand these risks and I voluntarily assume them. Adults have that right. There's been a few cases, including Connecticut, where courts have said, have refused to recognize assumption of risk forms for adults too. But the vast majority of states, they are binding contractual commitments. So I do recommend, if you're sending a group of adults on a short-term missions trip, like our church is sending a group to Cuba, and Carter is a JFK fan, so I pronounce Cuba the way that JFK did. Cuba. Having lived in Massachusetts, you know, there's a very simple rule. Any word that ends in a vowel, you put an R on the end. And any word that ends with an R, you take the R off. If you remember that, you're going to do fine in Massachusetts. But so we're going to, we haven't talked about this, but I'm assuming we'll be doing assumption of risk forms.
We have them together.
We have them, okay.
A follow-up question to that question of the consent forms. I know some places that have, you know, in the context of your kind of annual youth ministry events or annual kids ministry events, try and make an annualized form that, you know, asks the question, can the child swim, and here's kind of the parameters of the events, and they get it notarized. It gives a release to treat medically if a parent's unavailable. Are those something that's a good thing to use, or is it better to do one of those individually for each event?
Well, there's no litigation, no precedent addressing that, Carter, so we can't say for sure. I just anecdotally know that there have been a few cases, just you can count on one hand, where these forms have not been recognized by emergency room physicians because they were too generic. So, and mainly it was because they didn't identify who the person was who could make the medical decisions on behalf of the family. In those cases, they listed like the youth pastor, and in fact that person had changed office in the past year. So I think a year-long form is going to be fine as long as you, again, explicitly list what those risks are and what the activities are going to be. You know, not every event is going to involve swimming, but you can say, here are the activities that we're going to be engaged in for the next year: swimming, hiking, list them all. And I think under those circumstances, and most importantly, if you identify, let's say 3 people, any one of these 3 people can make emergency medical decisions, and you're reasonably certain that at least 2 of them are going to be around for the next 12 months, maybe only if it's just 1, but you've got 3 individuals named. And I think that overcomes the resistance I've seen in a few cases by medical room staffs to these forms.
Do you think it's still good to, especially for, I'll call them riskier events, do a parental permission slip or something like that, that details the activities going on at this specific event?
I'm not opposed to that, but I think it can be incorporated within the more generic form if that risk is identified. Like, we're going to go rope rappelling down a 100-foot cliff. You know what parent is right in mind. So this is an extremely high-risk event. Do you want your 6-year-old doing this? We had a kid at our church.
No, I don't want my 6-year-old.
That was rope rappelling and a youth activity and fell 100 feet under rocks. And he got up and he walked back to the group.
Oh my
and
goodness.
his mother said, I think it was a miracle.
I think it was.
No, I'm not saying the green light is on now. We can start.
One more follow-up there, Rich. How long, if we have whichever form we're using, how long do we need to hang on to those?
Well, you mean for assumption of risk forms or parental consent?
Parental consent, for particularly with regard to minor.
Yeah. Well, obviously, you want to keep them until the child is an adult, 18th birthday, plus whatever the statute of limitations is, at an absolute minimum. If it's an adult, I think you're good with whatever the statute of limitations is on personal injuries in your state.
Will an electronic copy of that archive
Yes.
suffice, or
It
does
will.
it need to hold on to the paper?
Yeah, it will. And if you have, you know, electronic storage is becoming so efficient and simple. I mean, so in the old days when everybody had to keep paper copies, the originals, it got to be a real problem. What's the soonest point we can destroy these things? But if electronic storage is not a big issue, then I would say keep them longer than shorter. And you know, because statute of limitations can be extended in some situations way beyond what the law says. You know, it says, like in Missouri, we have a 5-year personal injury statute of limitations, and so you'd want to keep an assumption of risk for at least 5. Why not keep it 10, just to be sure that we've got it? You want to have that form, obviously. That's critical. An assumption, and I think that's an important point, is the strategic importance of the form. So some forms, like invoices, you know, so what? Get rid of them. But when it's an assumption of risk, that is the, you know, what should I say, the most important document you have to defend yourself in the event of litigation. So why not keep that for an extended period of time? I think there's got to be a qualitative analysis of the document in determining how long we keep it.
I would suggest for camps, if you're going to have a camp, because there's so many specific things that the campers do, that each camp you'd have their own forms. But you know, that's the only, you know, that's what I see is when they go camping. I mean, they could be doing whitewater rafting, rappelling,
Zip
zip
lines.
lines. You know, they're doing
Firearms.
all of that sort of thing.
And you know, the 10-year-old's jumping up and down. I can't wait. And mom's looking at this saying,
No
whoa.
way.
Yeah.
Mom can wait.
Years.
So, go ahead, Gary.
I know this is changing topics a little bit, but it's kind of a hot topic for all of us, I guess, these days. Concerning concealed carry permits, holders bringing their weapons to church. I know in our state, it's not supposed to happen. It's illegal, apparently. But I had a discussion with our carrier, our insurance carrier, and they were recommending developing a policy for handling all these things in the church and having them actually sign off on that policy, so that later on,
Having who sign off?
the insurance company,
Okay.
the carrier, so that at some point in the future, if a tragic event occurred, that they wouldn't back out saying we can't cover your handling of this. Do you recommend that kind of
Well, it all
approach?
depends. They just can't gratuitously make a statement like that. That's got to tie into your policy. And
Right.
is there a specific exclusion that addresses? I can tell you that there isn't. I mean,
Okay.
this is all too new. They may be thinking about it behind closed doors. You know, how do we address this issue? I can understand that. But Jerry, you can weigh in on this.
Yeah, actually, I would tell you that there is not a specific exclusion for that. However, sometimes on the application, there may be a question: do you have any security? So what they will come back and do is say, if you misled the company on the question
In the application.
in the application, then they can come back and say, you misled us, therefore this policy is null and void. However, to date, there are no exclusions that says if you have people that have concealed carry, or if you have security guards that are working for you, is there an exclusion? Now, a lot of times I will tell you that if you do have armed security, sometimes companies will actually charge for that, as if, you know, if you're using that in a public setting. I will tell you with colleges, that is the case. However, with churches, either churches will, the insurance company will accept it or reject it. If they know you have it, you know, there's a common misconception that, you know, if I just don't tell the insurance company that I have this risk, they'll automatically cover it. For instance, if you know that something is a risk, you need to, actually, I would at least visit with your insurance agent and get in writing, because if he knows about it, you're safe. Okay, as long as there's not a physical exclusion. I'll give you, like, a lot of companies will actually exclude inflatables. So there's an actual exclusion on inflatables. There is not an exclusion when it comes to to security service or having people have a concealed carry. We actually talked about concealed carry before, but if you actually do what the local law enforcement does, you do the exact same training, you're okay, I think, having that kind of system. And actually, I will tell you that what we have done is I've always dealt with the insurance carrier and said, here's how we do it.
Right.
Okay, and the insurance carrier says, we like the way that you're setting this up, we'll allow it. I have also had insurance companies says, you can do this, but we don't like this, and we're going to cancel your policy. So, and I'm talking, there are 3 major writers of churches in the United States, possibly 4 if you include Philadelphia. So you got Church Mutual, Guide One, Brotherhood Mutual, Philadelphia Insurance Company. Those are your
And
4.
State Farm.
Well, I don't consider them.
They're not a dedicated church insurer, but they are typically 4th place.
I have not seen them
Yes.
writing as many churches.
Yeah, and the reason is you have a State Farm agent in your church that's on the board. And so many boards buy insurance because of that agent being there.
But then I also see that they do not have the proper coverages because
They're not a church insurance company.
That's correct. And that's kind of what I'm talking about is specialize in writing churches. So if you have a company that specializes in writing
And when I say
churches-
not a church insurance company, I mean they're not dedicated to the church market. And
Right.
so unlike the other 3 you mentioned, Church Mutual, Brotherhood, and Guide One, they are totally dedicated to the church market. And it shows, I think, in the coverages they provide and in the counsel you receive from their agents.
And that's the thing is that if you get a company that it actually is used to writing, this is their bread and butter, they will actually work with you because they're used to writing churches.
Right. That was the case here.
Yeah.
Where they recommended that we would outline the programs, the level of training and so forth and so on, and which, is a great thing to do. And we have certain security training for all of our people, including those that carry tasers and various things like that. And so they recommended that we put that in writing, have them sign off on it so there would never be any questions.
Yeah, and let me say this, there's been no litigation involving churches that have had maniacs, shooting on church premises. There's no case that's in this country where a church was sued because of that. So we have no precedent. There have been a couple of cases involving universities. You remember the Virginia Tech case a few years ago where like 30 people were killed by that maniac before he shot himself. There was a lawsuit brought by 4 family members, and they all received $4 million at a trial court for negligence, and because the school didn't have an adequate policy. That was appealed to the Virginia Supreme Court, which just rendered its opinion fairly recently, and they reversed all those judgments and threw the case out. And the reason was the university was not negligent. They didn't have any, to be negligent, there's got to be foreseeability of injury. And there had been no such incidents happen on university premises, so there was no reason to believe this was going to happen that would have warranted extreme measures. And I think that's an important point. You can have your policy, but you don't need it in terms of legally. There's no legally, if we started seeing cases all over the country where churches were being found liable, we could begin maybe to articulate recommendations there, but to date there's none. And in fact, the few analogous cases we see, they're thrown out because of the lack of foreseeability. So the legal duty is attached to foreseeability. And if you have, oh yeah, we've had gunfire in our parking lot or on our premises before, you better believe you've got a legal duty to go to the next step and institute a comprehensive program. But if you've had no weapons-related crimes on your premises or adjacent perhaps in recent history, there's no legal duty to do anything. Now some churches say, well, there's not a legal duty, but we believe we have an ethical or maybe a theological duty, a spiritual duty to protect innocent life. And I'm not opposed to that. I'm just saying you don't need to do it until you start seeing people shooting each other on or near your property. Then the courts would say it becomes foreseeable, and that triggers the duty of care to avoid a negligence claim. But I see churches get really agitated over this issue, and they read something in the paper and, oh man, we've got to have this full-fledged vigilante group within the church. And in many cases, it's counterproductive. These people aren't trained. I've got a CCW, and you know, I have to say, I'm the last person you'd want as your, you know. No, but the point is that CCW status. There's a wide variety of competencies. From me on one hand to somebody that's truly competent on the other, and somebody that is skilled, maybe a current or retired military or police or law enforcement, that is extremely experienced in using firearms, and it's the kind of person you would want. And that's where it gets into your vetting process of who are we going to allow. Most states, people just can't use that permit to bring a gun into a church. It's limited. The church has got to consent to it. And you want to be careful who you consent to. But I think if you consent to only those with a demonstrable experience and expertise in handling firearms, then in conjunction with law enforcement, in my opinion, they should always be working subservient to uniformed police officers on your premises. And you say, well, how can we afford that? Well, it's not expensive. They're there for a couple hours on Sunday morning, maybe a few more hours during the week, but it's not a huge cost, and it's the best way you've got to manage a criminal situation. These people are trained in responding to criminal activity, and I think the most important point I'd make is that when they do respond to criminal activity, law enforcement officers cease to be your church's agent, and they become on duty, which cuts any liability to the church for their excessive use of force or their negligence. You might want to comment about our
Yeah, I was going to
practice.
say, we've kind of gone through the same thing lately, Gary, and I think one of the things that gets confusing about this is something I learned along the way working with Rich and our insurance company and some others in developing some of this, is the line can get really blurry between what we're defining as our church-defined security response and what is just part of a CCW permit holder like Rich wanting to carry his gun on the church property. And we found that what we needed to write into our policy was something that clearly defines that difference. And you know, like Rich alluded to, the laws are different in every state. In Missouri, anyone that goes through a reasonable amount of training can apply and get a concealed carry permit, but there are 17 locations where they have to seek additional permission to carry in those locations. Churches are one of those. But the clause that talks about churches is very vague about who can give that permission. So a couple of years ago, we developed at Central a policy with our church board that basically defined that it is our church board who gives that permission. Nobody else can give it, nobody else can revoke it. It's our church board. But we also made it very clear that just because we give that permission, it in no way, shape, or form defines you as being a deputized security officer of the church. That you are expected to comply with state law at all times, and it's basically just extending your state CCW permit to our premises. And it has certain other conditions, you know, like Rich mentioned, he teaches 5th grade Sunday school. He signed a document that he agrees to not carry when he's working in that capacity, and some other clauses like that are part of that policy. Everyone who wants to, who's a CCW permit holder, should be familiar with the laws of the state of Missouri because they've gone to a class for that, and they should know that they need to request that permission. So we have an application they fill out. It goes through all these clauses. It goes before our church board. The church board votes, takes action on every one of those, and then we do have a security team that kind of follows up, keeps tabs on who has this permission, do we feel good about them having that permission, and those types of things. But a totally separate aspect of that is our security response, which is built, like Rich alluded to, on uniform. We use Greene County Sheriff's officers here. We've got a few other people who work closely with those, but the people who are dealing with weapons for us are Greene County Sheriff's officers. And what our insurance company wanted to see was that we had a clearly defined line between those two. And we worked closely with them. That we sent them our document. They sent back a couple of questions. They just wanted some things clarified. It helped us see there might have been some stuff we could write a little bit more clearly in our policy, so we did, and we sent that back to them. And ultimately, we landed in a spot where they were happy and we were happy, and I think that we found that. But I think the thing that trips us up sometimes is we really almost, I think sometimes we need to disambiguate what is church security and what is what is part of just the state law CCW permission.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what the insurance companies want to see, that we've got a
Yeah,
handle on.
I agree.
Maybe you know better about that, Jerry.
Exactly. Working with your police department or sheriff's department is very, very important, because actually I will tell you that I've had sheriff's departments saying, if we see people with guns, we're taking them down. We don't, you need to have some way of distinguishing and them knowing who the security people are. So I mean, I've had actually.
If you see some guy shooting wildly in the church, you don't know if that's your security guy or if that's.
No, but if you see a person with a gun, they're looking to whoever's carrying a gun.
That again is another reason we make sure our uniformed security guys know who's been granted that permission to carry. So if they notice somebody carrying, they know if that person has permission or if it's a gun that doesn't belong. And they've been trained that if it's a gun that doesn't belong, they confront it and find out what the story is on it. But they also know, and if they don't know the person right offhand, they can easily look up and see. We've got a way, again, in our management software, a way for them to look up and see who's been extended that permission from the church board.
And we make sure that's only in Missouri for 3 years. Those are current permits.
Yes, we verify their permit, and we make their permission expire with their permit. So if they renew their permit, they've got to renew their permission with us in a separate application.
We have another member of our deacon board that has a CCW permit, and he was so obsessed with getting the first recognition from the church board. And here I am, know nothing about guns, and I was going to be second place. But he wasn't there the night we made the formal decision, and so they bumped him to second, and I got first place.
We had to delay the decision a couple of months as we worked through this with the insurance company, and David missed the meeting where we actually took the action. So
but he
Rich
said to
made
me,
sure the minutes reflected that he was number one.
And he told me later, he said, Rich, anytime I'm second to Rich Hammer, I consider that to be an honor.
There you go.
That was a great compliment.
Well, you know what? The time has traveled really fast. I know that you guys probably had a few more things that you'd like to discuss, but I think we got some really important subjects here. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for letting us use your facility, Gary. And thanks, Rich, for all the knowledge that you bring. And thank you for watching Risk Management Live. We will see you next month when we bring you another topic that is just cutting edge. We'll see you then. Thank you very much.